The Kent State Massacre happened during the Vietnam era in the United States on May 4, 1970, inflicted by Ohio National Guard and shot fired toward a large group of students at Kent University. On that day, 4 students were killed and 9 were wounded, though the reasons for this violence will never be known for its exact reasoning. The Flower Child era began in the 1960s to 1970s. They rejected conventional society and advocated for love, peace, and simple idealistic values. These hippies' goals were to give everyone the freedom of self-expression and a lot of focus on women's equality. However, most did not think that this was the time to celebrate peace. People thought that hippies were just a bunch of druggies, which wasn't a lie. During the hippie movement, the drug levels were getting higher, resulting in more overdoses and crime. They also protested against the Vietnam War, which was a major issue they opposed. In 1970, a joint U.S.-South Vietnamese operation invaded Cambodia, hoping to wipe out DRV supply bases there. The South Vietnamese then led their own invasion of Laos, which was pushed back by North Vietnam. This invasion of countries violated international law, though many Americans believed that defeating South Vietnam from communist aggression was in the nation's interest. This disagreement soon led to the Kent State Massacre. One of the main reasons the protest against the Vietnam War started was due to President Richard M. Nixon. He was elected in 1968 in hopes of ending the Vietnam War, and until 1970 he stood by that claim. On April 30, 1970, President Nixon authorized U.S. troops to invade Cambodia, a neutral nation located west of Vietnam. North Vietnamese troops were using safe havens in Cambodia to launch attacks on the U.S.-backed South Vietnamese and parts of the Ho Chi Minh Trail, a supply route used by North Vietnamese, passed through Cambodia. Nixon made this decision without notifying the Secretary and was accused of illegally widening the scope of U.S. involvement in the war by not receiving their consent through a vote. The public's reaction to what Nixon did was part of the reason for the events that happened at Kent State University in Northwest Ohio. Students were protesting at their universities all over the country. Kent State University specifically began its protest on May 1, 1970. Several people spoke out that day against the war, and especially President Nixon. It was caught by reporters that night of altercations between police and students. Police claimed their cars were hit by bottles and that students stopped traffic and were lighting bonfires in the streets. Local bars around the area were soon forced to close, which made the protesters irritated and become much larger. Police used tear gas to then move the crowd back toward campus. The next day, May 2nd, 1970, there were threats toward Kent State University. As a result, the Ohio National Guard was sent to the university to calm tensions down. They got there that night, though protesters had already started setting fires to the ROTC buildings as others watched and cheered. Guardsmen and protesters began to clash, and many were arrested. The next day, it was remotely calm. Still, there were nearly 1,000 guards posted on the campus. On May 4th, there was already a protest scheduled for that noon. Guardsmen tried to stop this event, though by 11 o'clock, there were estimated 3,000 people there, compared to the 100 guardsmen armed with rifles. On this day particularly, advocates focused on how they were against the National Guard being there and the Vietnam War. The protest was initially peaceful, but guards were still ordered to disperse via a Kent State officer using a bullhorn to make the announcement out of a moving military jeep. To this, protesters began throwing rocks and shouting at guardsmen. Guardsmen were ordered to throw tear gas into the crowd to dislocate them. Protesters were being dislocated to a football field with a large fence, trapping them. so protesters began yelling and throwing rocks yet again. Guardsmen began to retreat, though witnesses say that they saw 28 guards start to fire their rifles, either in the air or directly toward the crowd. In the span of 13 seconds, 70 shots were fired. 4 students were killed and 9 were injured. The murdered victims included Jeffrey Miller, Allison Crossy, William Schrodier, and Sandra Schrodier. The university closed immediately after the killings for 6 weeks. Court trials were held in which guards said they felt that they had no choice. Finally, 7 years later, the Ohio National Guards agreed to pay those families that lost a loved one that day $675,000. Justice took so long due to the public being divided on what happened on May 4th. People were divided since they were against the protesters in the beginning, and when they were shot dead, people just thought they had it coming since they were being destructive. Also, most people agreed with the Vietnam War due to them wanting to unify the country of Vietnam under a communist government, and the United States, with the aid of the South Vietnamese, attempting to prevent the spread of communism. Death is usually the follow-up of protest. A recent example would be multiple political protests in 2020, when 25 people died. 11 people were killed due to participating in political protest, while 14 were killed due to incidents linked to political unrest. 9 others were demonstrators speaking up for Black Lives Matter. 2 other victims were conservatives killed after pro-Trump patriot rallies.